Welcome to this
sessão
new session,
que nós
to
estamos
this training
agora
that we're imparting from VCA. If you need translation or interpretation, remember that you can always access the channels of interpretation so then you can hear today's session. Giving you a warm welcome. My name is Paz Gonzalez. I belong to the organization Avina. And we are one of the members that belong to VCA. And as I just reminded each one of you, we do have interpretation in Portuguese, French, Spanish, and Bahasa. Please make sure that your name appears together with your organization's name in the label so we can get to know you better. And please remember that you can also write your questions in the section of questions and answers. And you can actually write them down in your own language as you please. You can also write your comments, your impressions in the chat because we will be reading it. And you can also raise your electronic hand in the section of questions and answers. As we have reminded you, this training is mainly focused on those who are allies, and it's directed to those who are part of VCA. And I just would like to remind you that the learning and outcomes that you will be having from this process, we will be sharing them at COP29. And that is thanks to the participation of the different organizations that are part of our alliance. I really hope that you find this session useful, and we thank our colleagues, Marina, who belongs to Interface, so that everybody who participates in the COP29 or COP30 or 31 can be better trained in a very practical way and to make our participation more effective, and that you can enhance your own priorities at those meetings. So I will give the floor now to Marina Naves to start the session of today.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'd like to thank the VCA Alliance for inviting us to deliver this training. For me, it's a privilege to be here in this room full of advocates and activists. So I will share my presentation so we can start the third workshop of the Global Climate Advocacy Training, which is about the art of advocacy. So I'll share it just a second. So I need someone to stop sharing the screen so I can share. Yeah, thank you. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
So today we are going to talk about types and modalities of lobby and advocacy, challenges and opportunities related to international advocacy, negotiating change, so some tips about negotiation, some techniques, and we'll start looking at an advocacy practical guide with 7 steps, and we'll continue next Tuesday. Okay, so this is what we have, a summary of today's workshop. So today we have myself and Gustavo here. Gustavo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure, Marina, thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Gustavo Diniz. I'm speaking from São Paulo, Brazil. I'm a partner of Interface Advocacy. I'm an expert in public affairs and government relations. I'll be providing support throughout this remaining 2 sessions of this workshop on global climate advocacy. And it's a privilege to be here with you all today. And I wish you all a great session. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you, Gustavo. So everyone, Gustavo and I have been working with lobby and advocacy for the past 15 years or more. So we have really shared in these 2 sessions we try to share almost everything we learned in our careers. So there will be a lot of our best practices, what we learned on the field, the do's and don'ts. We'll try to bring a lot of very practical tips for you guys to have a very strong, solid advocacy plan for COP29 and COP30. So feel free to interrupt us and make questions. You can also leave your questions on the Q&A box, and Gustavo will help guide me through the questions because now I cannot see your faces, but he'll be there to support me to go through the questions. And we will also have some slides on these presentations to make some stops for questions, but feel free to interrupt if you need. Okay, so there is a bonus opportunity on this training. So we'll talk more about this on the next session. On the 4th workshop, we'll leave you with an advocacy plan template. So it's a template so that you can fill in and have a very strong and solid advocacy plan for your participation at COP29 and COP30. So this will be a bonus opportunity for up to 10 organizations. So I'll invite Paz to talk a little bit about the eligibility criteria to receive this 1-hour mentoring session. This is the bonus opportunity, having this 1-hour mentoring session to discuss your advocacy plan with us from Interface Advocacy. Paz, could you please go through the eligibility criteria?
Well, as Marina was saying, this is an opportunity that you can have, and we are truly hoping that you can make use of it. And the idea of this session is that you can have an orientation on how to write your advocacy plan. And we would really like you to share with us your template, your advocacy plan template. And that you can share it while we're still doing the training or just before the next training, so then we can give you more guidelines, because we would like to choose 10 organizations who can have this extra 1-hour session. We are going to prioritize those members who are already part of VCA. And we're going to choose among those who have already shared with us their template in their preferred language, because the idea is that you can have these mentoring sessions in your own language, because these are the languages that the experts speak. We also recommend to you to participate in the 2 sessions we have, the one of today and the next one we are having. So then you can have as much information as you can, and especially to make use of the template we will be using and sharing with you. We will also be giving priority to those groups who will be working among minority groups and those who are in a situation of vulnerability, like indigenous peoples groups, marginalized people, like, for instance, those that recycle. We don't want to sound excluding, but we need to make priority in who we can choose. So these are the guidelines for us to choose those people who will be participating in this extra session. So and this will help us to know how to choose, because we don't know how many templates we will be receiving and applying for this opportunity. Thank you, Marina.
Oh. Am I in the right channel? Can someone just let me know if I'm being translated? Is it okay now, the translation? Okay, thank you. There is, I think the French interpreter has an issue. He lost the connection. He's telling me he needs to be reassigned to the translation channel. So please let me know when it's fixed so I can move on. Is it okay now? Do you have the French translator on the channel? Okay, so he's asking Karen to support.
Yeah, you should be assigned now. Let me know if you are.
I think it's okay now. Can we move on?
Okay.
Karen, is it good now? Can I move on?
Yeah, I'm just starting to add him to the room. Just give me one more minute. Let me just sort this out again. Okay, Eve, would you mind? Okay, would you mind logging out and coming back in again, please? Okay, apologies, everybody. We're just waiting for Eve to join us again. Okay. Hi, Eve. Let me just try to assign you back to your room. Okay, there you go. You should be sorted now. Thank you, everybody, for your questions.
Thank you.
Karen. Okay, so just a recap. So next session, we are going to deliver an advocacy plan template so that you can fill in with the information we are going to provide throughout today and next Tuesday's advocacy session. So we'll share an advocacy toolkit, like a guide. So in the next session, you have the template you can fill in, and then we'll choose, offer this bonus opportunity for up to 10 organizations. But we'll talk more about this next Tuesday. So let's warm up, just a little bit of sense of humor for the session. We have a Mentimeter. Let's, check how you guys feel prepared, or how do you think your organization is prepared for advocating at the upcoming COP. So I ask you to please go to this Mentimeter. You can use the QR code or the link. I'm going to ask Gustavo to post the link on the chat, and we can see in a while how do you think your organization is doing regarding your advocacy plan for COP29. And there is no right or wrong answer. Everywhere, independently of where you are on this process, it is fine. Everything is fine. and we are going to support you to move on and advance on your advocacy agenda for COP29 and COP30. So I'll ask Gustavo to share his screen so that we can see this Mentimeter. Let's see how you guys feel you are doing, how your preparation is for COP29. And as I said, there is no right or wrong. We're just, trying to bring some sense of humor. And these workshops meant to support you on this journey to prepare yourselves and your organizations for COP. So some people think they're not prepared at all. Okay, so we hope with these 2 sessions, you can feel more prepared to arrive and hit the ground running at COP29. Some people are like, wait, what is advocacy? We're going to talk about it. So we'll have a lot of, concepts about advocacy. So you can leave this session knowing what advocacy is about and being more prepared to start and prepare your plans. Some people feel they're like, okay, somehow prepared. Okay, 22% feel they are somehow prepared, but they have room to prepare even more. 11% thinks, okay, we have a few things in place. And up to the moment, nobody feels like you're on top of it, which is fine. We almost never in life feel we are in top of it, of everything. So, okay, so we have like a diagnosis of where most people feel they are for COP29. And this workshop will help a lot on this, on how to get prepared to have an advocacy plan, to have clarity of your advocacy goals. This is what these 2 workshop sessions were prepared for. So thank you, Gustavo, for sharing. We are going to add these screens on the presentation when we send them to you. You have these, prints. So thanks a lot for sharing, for, providing your feedback on this Mentimeter. Okay, can you see my screen back again? Yes. Okay. So let's start the content of the day talking about types and modalities of lobby and advocacy. So there is no clear-cut definition of what advocacy is, and this can cause confusions. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what advocacy means. And partially this confusion comes from the fact that most countries don't have regulations for lobby and advocacy activities. Like I'm in Brazil, here we don't have a regulation yet. I think in Latin America, Chile is the main reference of lobby regulation. I think Peru and Mexico has a kind of regulation, but the other countries don't have. I know in Asia, South Korea, Taiwan have a regulation in place, but most countries don't. So the United States has a lobby regulation since the 40s, but it's the only country that has had a lobby regulation for like almost 8 years. Some European countries and Australia also have a lobby regulation, but most countries don't have this, and that's why there is a lack of clarity. So in this session, we are going to talk about these concepts, try to bring clarity on this. So in general terms, we're going to bring some definitions for advocacy to start putting light on this concept that can be so broad. So the first concept we have here, advocacy refers to the range of actions taken to influence decision-making and bring about policy change. These actions can be diverse, but they must all contribute to the desired transformation of a specific policy. Another possible definition is advocacy goes beyond just policy change, including shifts in behaviors and practices, as well as increased public support for a cause. And another definition is advocacy is not about its end goal, but the journey, as it can involve anything from building coalitions to lobbying to media outreach. The sheer variety of activities makes advocacy conceptualization a complex task. So these are some references we brought from Imaflora Advocacy Guide. On the end of this presentation, you'll find other the references we use. So here there are other examples that you guys can read when we send over this presentation. So we have brought definitions from the Open Society Foundation, from TAXO, which is the European Union Support for Civil Society, from UNICEF. So each organization brings its own definition for advocacy, but it usually has to do with influencing change on public policies. Now, you may ask yourself, what is the difference between advocacy, lobbying, or activism? So we hear these three words and we think, are they the same? What is the difference? So one possibility of categorizing these three activities, in some regions, they are differentiated by the interest they defend. So some people consider they are the same activity, but depending on the nature of the interest they are defending, they can be considered activism, lobbying, or advocacy. So when you're talking about a public interest, so someone or an organization that is defending something that is an interest of the whole society, a public interest, they should consider this an activism or advocacy. And when someone or an organization is defending a private interest, so the interest of a company or a group of companies, that should be considered lobbying. So this is one way, one manner of differentiating these three activities. In some regions, people will look at the nature of the interest that these activities will be related to. Another possibility of differentiating these categories, so differentiating advocacy from lobbying, from activism, is considering the strategies or the tools that are used or associated with these terms. In this sense, we can understand that lobbying is more focused on negotiation and dialogue. And these are processes that are occurred directly with decision makers and not necessarily have to be public. So in this other category, we differentiate advocacy, lobbying, and activism by the strategies utilized. So when we say lobbying, we are referring to this direct engagement with decision makers. When we say activism, we are talking about public actions that seek to attract the attention of society and decision makers and uses the confrontation of ideas and conflict as strategies for political dispute. So on activism, we're talking about raising awareness, making sure people understand there is a dispute, there is a conflict, and that we need to have this clash of ideas. And the confrontation is usually associated with the activism as, an activity. And advocacy would be the most comprehensive term because it could encompass both strategies from lobby and advocacy. It's usually more related to the public interest, but in some occasions could be related to the private interest as well. So in the workshop, we are going to use the term advocacy because it's broader and it comprehends more strategies and tools. So from now on, we are going to use the term advocacy because we consider it to be more comprehensive. So in terms of strategies, when we're talking about policy changes, tackling issues, we can go from fields where there are intense disputes to fields where there is consensus, diplomacy, and the possibility of dialogue. And in between, we have a range of different strategies that we can adopt. So today we're going to talk a little bit about these different strategies because they are all part of this field of influencing public policies. Because we're talking here more about the COP environment, we'll be talking a little bit more about strategies related to lobby and advocacy. So just for us to start exercising a little bit our vocabulary on advocacy tactics. we have different blocks of activities, strategies, tools that are related to advocacy. One that would be closer to the, let's say, lobby field regards the direct engagement. So when we are planning an advocacy action, we could include strategies or tools, and we're going to talk more about those by the end of this workshop and in the next session. We can include strategies or tools like meetings, direct meetings with decision makers, participation in events, sending letters and emails, preparing informal meetings, sending research results and policy papers, participation in public hearings. This would be like a block of strategic actions related to direct engagement within the advocacy field. Another possibility, like another block of activities, are more related to communications. So preparing interviews, press releases, doing opinion articles like op-eds, doing social media outreach, preparing public letters, position papers, doing paid advertising in traditional or social media, signature gathering campaigns. This would be another possible field of activities inside the advocacy field. Political manifestations is like another block of activities that would be closer to the activism matter. So organizing marches and demonstrations, doing litigation process, organizing boycotts, public letters, open letters, organizing occupations or sittings, doing public assemblies or town hall meetings, doing symbolic plebiscites or referendums. This is another block of activities related to advocacy. Institutional capacity is another field of activities. So here we're talking about developing coalitions and partnerships, doing capacity building programs like the one we're doing now. This is part of an advocacy campaign.
No, that's true. Pause. Let's wait a moment to see. I'll let her know. Most probably.
Lavio, did you have a question? Or
I would like to know, we are in a society where it is very hard to understand the rights due to lack of knowledge. And I hope you can hear me. Therefore, in a society where there's lack of knowledge on climate change, how is it that we can achieve something to bring everyone together to make a awareness campaign in the communities. Since we are in a very far away area where the community does not have the basic of basics, they live out of they live day to day, and everything around them, the nature is changing, and what they eat is really hard. So how can we make them aware?
Sorry, everyone, I lost my connection, but I'm back.
Yeah, I'll try to tell Marina what Lavio just asked. Marina, Lavio is from Mozambique, I guess, and he was talking about how when you are in an isolated region with limited resources, how can you promote impact in the climate agenda? I think that we will address that at some point in your talk, but I don't know if you have anything to mention at this stage. So please let us know.
Yes, thank you, Lavi, for your comment. We're going to talk about this in the next session. We're going to talk about advocacy, the global reach, and how the digital revolution that we're going through is impacting advocacy. So I really thank you for your comment. I'll address this issue in a moment. So if I can move on, and when I talk about this, I will call you and just make sure you are paying attention. But we'll talk about this in a minute. I'm really sorry, everyone. I lost my connection. This doesn't happen often, but I'll share my screen again. So I was finishing to show the advocacy tactics. Gustavo, can you let me know if I could finish, or did I drop off before concluding?
I guess the fourth block was left when you.
Okay, I will recap. So the last block. Thank you. So I need the co-host, please, to share my screen. Karen, can you please provide me the co-host? Because I lost it.
Sure, just give me 1 second. Let me just find you. Here we go. There we are.
Let's recap. The last block we're talking about is the institutional capacity. Just let me check if I'm on the channel. Just a second. Channel. Perfect. So on this block, we're talking about institutional capacity regarding advocacy, and it can include building coalitions. So for example, Voices for Just Climate Action is a coalition. It unites people from different parts of the world. So this is one strategy. When Lavio asks, how can I empower and enhance my advocacy capacity when I'm in a place that is isolated, that doesn't have so much internet or other capacities? So one way of strengthening and enhancing advocacy is getting united by an advocacy, by a coalition, building partnerships. This is what I'm calling institutional capacity. So this is supporting partners that may be in isolated places that cannot reach global events. So we organize coalitions and this type of advocacy activities to enhance our institutional advocacy capacity. Other options regarding institutional capacity is organizing these trainings like the one we're having now. This is empowering a whole network of advocates, fundraising, so raising resources to empower advocacy actions, doing mobilizations, doing public policies, analysis and research in different places, organizing meetings and activities. So all of these are potential actions regarding this advocacy related to institutional capacity. So raising the institutional profile and the institutional strength of organizations that are within a certain network so that they can, increase their advocacy capacity. So we are going to talk about these strategies in depth today and in the next workshop. I just wanted to open up this session showing all these possibilities of advocacy actions and strategies. Now, given that we have discussed a little bit different possibilities of advocacy activities, I'd like you to answer this Mentimeter. So let's interact a little bit more. You can go to the link. I'll ask Gustavo to post the link on the chat, or you can use the QR code. And the question here is, what type of advocacy activity does your organization engage in most frequently? In other words, among these activities I have shared with you, which are the ones you are more familiar with? So I'll ask your collaboration on this. If you can please share your perception of what is more familiar to you on this Mentimeter. Let's take a look. So 50%, a lot of you are used to doing direct engagement, which is like an activity within the advocacy framework, more related to lobbying, direct engagement. 17% does communication, now 14% does communication activities like social media activations, campaigns. Some of you are
Yeah. Yeah. Our internet must be very unstable today. Let's just see the final results of the Menti perhaps pass, and while we wait Marina to return. That's interesting. Yeah. That's interesting here that nobody marked the option political manifestations. So there are no activists in the room. But good to hear that we have other types of activities that are also being undertaken by you and your organizations. There are few people that are giving their contributions, still no political manifestations.
Yes, I have an experience on this. Should I say that I am in a project by name? Influencing communities on climate change facilitation. What we have done in Mozambique, here in the province of Zambezia, is to speak to people in a way that they would be able to look out for climate change. And how do we speak to them? We go out in the community, on the streets, and we start a dialogue with people, asking people what is that people see and how would it be different. So this experience that I've seen and with my organization, my association, also teaching people on how to plant trees, but we have lots of difficulties because the lack of knowledge of people. When we speak to people, people say, no, this person is here just talking nonsense. So it's almost uh, a lack of perception at the community level. So we do have those difficulties, but we do have interactions with people. But we have to tell the government, telling them that we are using this instrument, speaking to people, and the local government with this information will be able to talk to people to tell them that we're coming. So it is a challenge. At the end of the day, it is a challenge, especially in this community where we are located in Mozambique.
Just to let you all know that Marina requested just a few more seconds so she can reboot her system and try to reconnect. I think we have like a raised hand from Sardi. Marina is back as well.
Select. Okay, my name is Sardi Winata from Penabulu organization. I work for a VCA climate project under HIPPOS in Indonesia. I agree with the option of direct engagement as one strategies or act or tactics in advocacy, because in the current democracy area, I think direct engagement is the most appropriate strategy. One example that I can say, in Indonesia, political manifestation is more prominent before the transformation or the Reformation era in Indonesia, but with the opening of access of democracy, direct engagement is deemed to be the most strategic option. So in one region in Indonesia, we support a local initiative to protect the community-based coastal area. So we talked to the local villagers to support these activities so they can get support and recognition, especially in terms of financial support. So this is one. So in terms of the financing is one of the key issues. So we need to educate them in terms of the public policies that is currently in the nationwide. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sorry
Sardi,
again.
for sharing your local experience.
Yeah, Pasardi was asking if he got his point across.
Yes, yeah, sure.
Yes. and we'll talk about this, the impact of advocacy and the representation related to the advocacy strategies related to communications, manifestations, and social media. We'll talk about this right in the next session. So I'm back. Can you hear me well? I think I'm in the channel. Okay, I'll share again my screen. So can you see my screen already? Yes, okay, thank you. So we talked about some advocacy strategies, and I'd like to go deeper into one of them to do a quick analysis, pros and cons analysis regarding advocacy coalitions. And coalitions are a trend. They are like a trend in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. They have become very popular among advocates. But like all the other strategies, they bring advantages and disadvantages. So I have been seeing in the last years in my career regarding advocacy and lobby, a lot of people exploring this tactic, the coalitions. And I'd like to raise your attention that coalitions, although they bring some advantages, they also bring some disadvantages. So before initiating a coalition, it's important to analyze both. So regarding advantages, coalitions, they increase a lot the credibility and the legitimacy of your issue. So one thing is one or two organizations defending a cause or an initiative. It's different when you have a group of like 10 or 15 or 20 organizations that are engaged on a certain issue. So they do increase legitimacy. They also increase a lot the reach and the impact of certain campaigns. They can be like Lazio was saying, if you are in an isolated place, then joining a coalition could increase your voice, your reach, the impact of your campaign a lot. That could be an important advocacy tactic for someone that is living in an isolated region. So for this type of goals, an advocacy coalition could be very helpful. They also reduce costs and maximize resources. So if you don't have much resources for a project, joining efforts with other organizations may empower your organization advocacy goal, because then you can share the costs, and this would be good for everyone to maximize its resources when you don't have solid fundraising, for example. Coalitions may be also a reputation shield. And what I say by reputation shield is that if you have a reputation attack, it doesn't go directly to your organization. So the coalition it's kind of a buffer zone. It decreases the impact of certain reputation attacks if you have on your campaign. And coalitions can also help you to increase or enhance your fundraising capacity. So if you have more voices united, you have more credibility, and thus you increase the chances of having a well-succeeded fundraising capacity. On the other hand, coalitions may bring you some challenges, and this is what I'd like to analyze with you. Because there is a lot of enthusiasm around coalitions, but sometimes people don't analyze the downside of coalitions. And one of them is that it's very complex to manage coalitions. The governance system around the coalition can be very intense and very challenging. So you have different actors, you have to consider different interests, different styles. Sometimes these coalitions are in different regions with different work or cultures. So it's a very complex governance. You need to have, sometimes you need to have a third party involved to help you to manage the coalition, someone that is more neutral. Coalitions tend to have a slow-paced decision-making process because it involves so many actors and interests. It's natural that slows down the decision-making process. Coalitions can also restrain the strategy or limit your focus. So when you're talking about possibilities of strategic actions, it's more complicated to find a common denominator when you have a lot of people involved. It's like organizing a trip. It's something to organize a trip for 2 or 3 people. It's completely different if you're organizing a summer trip for 20 people, let's say. It becomes a lot more challenging to cover the interest of everyone that is involved. Reputation risks. So if you are involved with a large number of organizations, it could be that an organization within your coalition has a reputation, a not so good reputation, and that could impact you as well because you're related to that organization somehow. So this is something you should analyze carefully. Who are the members of the coalition I'm building or I'm participating? Is the risk worthwhile? Is there a risk or not? This is important to analyze. And coalitions tend to also have conflicts, like in all human relations. You have conflicts related to decision power. So sometimes the power gets concentrated in some organizations within the coalition. It's also hard to share the responsibilities in a way that is very democratic. So among all of the advocacy tactics I went through, I just wanted to stress, this one may be the most challenges. It brings a lot of advantages, but it also brings disadvantages, and you should analyze these very carefully before starting a coalition. Okay, so do you have questions so far? So we have differentiated advocacy to lobby, from activism. We have talked about the concepts, some tactics. We are just opening up this session, but if you have questions so far, we have, a minute or two to listen to your questions or comments.
Yeah, there are no questions so far in the Q&A box, neither in the chat, but very good comments, Marina. People are coming up with some insights on the importance of communication, the importance of a shared vision between coalition members. I guess if we have no specific questions, we can move along.
Okay, so we have more space for questions throughout the presentation. So let's move on to the next session. Okay, so now we're going to talk about challenges and opportunities, and I'd like to remember that we're going to address what Lavio said regarding, the difficulties of someone that wants to achieve a global agenda, but at the same time, this person is living in an isolated place. So we will address this at this session. So I'd like to call your attention to the fact that we are living a historic moment. And what do I call this? What is this historic moment? So some of you may have born after the creation of the internet, and you are not so aware of how the world was before the digital revolution. So what we're seeing in this past, let's say 20 to 30 years, is that the digital revolution, the creation and invention of the internet, the social media invention has impacted a lot the political systems, especially the democratic regimes, because they have enhanced participation and inclusion. So now what we're seeing is a much greater inclusion and representation on political systems. So before the invention of internet and social media, political part and activism, like political manifestations, were the main means to impact public policies. Now we have so many platforms, so many digital channels, social media. We have many ways to impact the political systems, especially on democratic regimes. because we have different platforms and manners to impact the debate. So nowadays, everyone can become an influencer. Of course, it's not simple to become an influencer, but we have tools and platforms to impact the decision-making process. And it wasn't like this in a recent past, things were very different. And to illustrate what I'm talking about, I'd like to share a quote from Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister for the United Kingdom in the 40s and the 50s. He was a polemic guy, you know, but he said something that was, you know, partially true back then. It's not true so nowadays, but back then that was the reality. He said, "There is no such thing as public opinion. There is only published opinion." For us nowadays, it may be hard to get this, but what he was saying is that back then, the society, the public opinion didn't have so much power. The power was among the opinions that were published. So the power was held by those who had control of the communication channels. And there weren't many communication channels. There were very few and limited communication channels. So very few people, limited groups controlled the opinion that society carried and how they could affect decision-making process. So the digital revolution has changed, has impacted a lot. So coming back to Lavio's comment, one way to impact the global agenda, if you are in an isolated place, is really using these digital tools, is participating in digital debates like the one we are having now, is, you know, creating content, trying to make partnerships and create content with people that are in other areas of the world. So things have changed a lot in the past 20 years. And I'd like to, you know, use this moment to analyze the opportunities and the challenges that this change, this digital revolution have created. So as we said, the global reach of the advocacy actions is much bigger, is much broader nowadays. We can do like, you know, the VCA that includes partners from different countries. So we are seeing the reach increasing in advocacy campaigns. We have cross-border collaboration. So nowadays with these digital tools, we can share, you know, best practices, successful campaigns like we're doing now. We can create projects together. This is a huge opportunity. So share best practice, learn with other people, with bigger organizations or bigger coalitions. We can, you know, enhance this knowledge sharing. And also leverage international frameworks like agreements, like the UNFCCC is a framework. You know, it's the Climate Convention framework for climate change. And somehow we're all involved on this, debating this right now. And this wouldn't be possible, let's say 30 years ago. It would be a lot more challenging to discuss and impact these frameworks. And regarding the challenges, so some things we should pay attention on is that the diversity of cultural and political landscapes involved on these advocacy agendas can make it a lot more challenging. So it requires that we study more, we get, you know, to understand complex issues, have sensibility to deal with diverse cultural diversity. We have competing agendas. So because we have such a huge reach on these global advocacy campaigns and agendas, it's harder to get to be the #1 priority in a stakeholder agenda. So we have this issue of competing priorities, and thus we need to be more creative. It's harder to reach consensus when we are talking about a global arena. So this is another challenge. And the most problematic challenge, in my opinion, is the fake news. So the ever-increasing sources of information creates a lot of, you know, information, but also creates misinformation. And this is something we have to take into consideration, that we are also tackling fake news, and we need to also cope with these not liable sources of information. So this is just for us to dive into this big picture of global advocacy that we are participating and understand a little more, the pros and cons, the challenges and the opportunities we are facing. Do you have any comments, questions so far before we start the next session that is about negotiating change? I don't see your faces, so I'm just pausing to make sure you're all here. Okay, I don't see questions. Gustavo, do you see any question? I don't think we have.
No, Marina, so far.
Okay,
Sardi, I guess
yeah.
Sardi has a question.
Please.
I do have a questions for you pertaining to the 4 books of tactics and how is it relevant to the challenges in advocacy. Could you please elaborate more on that? Thank you.
Yeah, so let me go back to that slide again. Oops, where is it? Okay, so I think this is the slide he was referring to. What I wanted to say here, Sardi, is that we have different blocks of activities. So advocacy is very broad and it can contains very different fields of activities. We're going to talk about this in the next workshop, so we'll dive deeper into these fields of possibilities. But this is just like a snapshot for you to realize that advocacy is broad. It goes from direct engagement to communications to building capacity. So like this coalition is a capacity building initiative from political manifestations. So now we won't talk about each of these tactics. We'll do this in the next workshop. I just wanted to open up the discussion by showing how broad advocacy can be. And in the bonus session, if you're interested to dive deeper into this, I do recommend you try to participate on the bonus opportunity, because on the next workshop, we're going to deliver a template where you can describe the activities, your advocacy plan, the activities you want to use to advocate during COP, and then you can choose among these activities which one will fit better into your COP participation. And in the bonus opportunity, in the mentoring session, we can go through them. We can analyze which of these activities can work better in your scenario. So I really do recommend you be here on the next workshop where we're going to get into the details of these tactics so that we can leave you a template and you can build your advocacy plan. But this was just a snapshot to show you, the ranges, the possibilities within advocacy. Do you have any specific question about one of them?
Okay, thank you. It's clear enough for me. Thank you.
And if I may add just like one kind comment, this is just like a classification, categorization effort. Of course, things overlap and they reinforce each other, each of these blocks. And the point here is just to show the complexity of advocacy activities, but of course they are integrated, and that's what we want to make clear throughout this workshop.
Yes, thank you, Gustavo. Okay, so I think we can move on. I don't see other questions, so let's move on. We'll have other opportunities for interaction. So now let's start talking about negotiating change. So we are going to talk on this session a little bit about negotiation techniques and tips, because advocacy is always about negotiating, right? We are negotiating change, either changing issues or public policy or votings. What we as advocates, we want is to promote change. So there is always a negotiation on the table. So this is very interesting, and this is why we call this session Advocacy, the art of advocacy. And what I'd like to strengthen here is that advocacy has, let's say, two components, one which is the art and the other which is the science. And you may be thinking, you know, what is she talking about? What is like art has to do with advocacy? Maybe you're not following, but what I'm calling art is the subjectivity part of advocacy. So in order to become an effective advocate, we sometimes need to be creative, innovative, and even use our intuitions to tackle public policies. Public policies environments can be very challenging. They can change very rapidly. So they demand a lot of adaptation, creativity. So I'd like to call your attention that for us advocates, soft skills are fundamental. They are very important. And we are going to talk about soft skills in a minute. But this is just, I wanted to open this session about negotiation, saying that advocacy has a very important component related to human relations. And another component that is more what we call science, that is more related to the planning part, you know, the importance of planning and being strategic. So advocacy has this component of art, like this mosaic. It can be very changing, very, you know, subjective. So before we move on, I'd like to ask one more time your collaboration on this Mentimeter. And the question now is, based on what we discussed so far, what ideas or keywords come to your mind when you think about advocacy now? So please use the QR code or the link to interact a little bit on this. You know, I'd like to have a snapshot to see how the group thinks about advocacy based on what we discussed so far. I'll give you 30 seconds to, you know, realize, reflect, what is the first word that comes to your mind when you think about advocacy, and share with us on the Mentimeter. Let's see if we have some responses. Let's see if we can form a mosaic of ideas. So some people think about advocacy as influencing, winning hearts and minds, engagement, being intentional. Some people think about it as art, influence again, collective action. Some people think about it as a coalition, as lobby. Very interesting. So you can see there are different perspectives on advocacy. We are going to share this on the presentation. So thank you very much for compliance. This is a very important word regarding advocacy, you know, compliance, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. So thank you so much for sharing your impressions and, you know, what comes to your mind when you think about advocacy. Thank you, Gustavo, for sharing. So let's go back to the presentation. So for me, when I think about advocacy, the first word that comes to my mind is influence. So advocacy is about this art of influencing people, people's ideas, changing status quo. Influence for me, in my experience, has a lot to do with, advocacy has to do with influence. And this ability to influence people or debates or policy changes is composed you know, this ability is composed by a lot of skills. These are what I called before as, you know, considered soft skills. So the ability to influence has to do with building trust, building debates, creating relationships, building narratives, creating affinity, enchanting. You know, when we are in a conversation with a lot of people and you have limited time, you have to create this enchanting to get people's attentions. Engagement, persuasion, dialogue, negotiations. For me, the ability to influence has to do with negotiating, right? And that's why this session is called the art of negotiation. You know, there is always a negotiation happening. And I have a question for you. When you start a negotiation, how does a good negotiation start? Now, what is the background that forms a good, you know, negotiation kickoff? And this is based in things that I have studied, but mostly on what Gustavo and I have lived in our professional careers, and you know what we have proved that worked in practical negotiations. So we believe that good negotiations start with curiosity, with an open state of mind. So being open and curious to get the other person we are negotiating with, and understanding that this is a win-win conversation. So I want to win something. I need something from this conversation, from this negotiation, but so does the other person that is here with me. So remembering this is very important. And that's why we're calling these bilateral negotiations. Remembering that every negotiation has at least two sides or more. And this is something important for you. Effective negotiators recognize that positive emotions increase the ability to find solutions and enhance collaborations. So when you remember that positive emotions will increase your chances of finding the solutions, of, you know, having this win-win relationship, you are more open to creating affinity, to create a positive background to start this conversation. So one very important question when you start a negotiation or an advocacy conversation, a very important question that must be on the back of your mind that will help you a lot is, what is important for the other person? I repeat, this question is really, really important. Have in your mind this question, what is important for the other person? Will remind you that advocacy conversations are negotiations. And bilateral negotiations are negotiations where we remember that I need something, but the other person also needs something. And I want this to be a win-win conversation, right? And this is hard to, it may be hard to assimilate, but this is important to say that even if you are negotiating the survival of humanity, which is your case when you are in a climate change discussion, take into consideration that the person you are negotiating with may have different priorities. I know this can be very disappointing, but it's important to remember that people may have different perspectives, different priorities. It may be that they have the same priority that you have, which is fighting climate change, but they may have different perspectives. They may see the issue in a different manner. So having this question in your mind will open up a conversation to lead you to discover what is important for the other person. And we'll talk about this in the next session when we talk about stakeholder mapping and studying your stakeholders. So we want to make sure we have win-win negotiations, win-win conversations, and we'll talk about this in the next Tuesday, in the next workshop. But I just want to remind you, this is very important when we're talking about negotiations. If you know what is important for the other person on this negotiation you're carrying through, you can analyze if you're able to offer what is important for the other person. And if you offer what they need, you have more chances of getting what you want from this negotiation. This may be basic, but sometimes we forget when we start negotiations, you know. So one important disclaimer regarding these bilateral negotiations is that these discussions, these negotiations, they must be ethical and they must happen within the legal framework. So if you're in a discussion that's not aligned with your ethical principles, with your organization's code of conduct, stop the negotiation and leave. You just want to participate in negotiations that happen within a legal framework and that are aligned with your organization's code of conduct. So if you cannot adjust this conversation, this negotiation, it's better to stop. And talking about people's interests, since we said that it's important to make yourself this question, what is important for the other person, I'd like to highlight and say that people's interests, they can vary a lot. And we'll talk about this in the next workshop when we talk about stakeholder categorization and mapping. But just to start talking about this a little bit, people have, a great variety of interests. So some people, they are interested, they need visibility. So when you are negotiating or you are discussing with politicians that depend on votings, they are in eligible positions, visibility is vital for their career style. They really need it. So maybe posting a picture, doing an article about your meeting with this person may be important for them, raising visibility. Accessing information, for some people, access to information is really relevant. And if you offer, access to information from study, from a research you have, this can open up their interest and get them to be a lot more engaged in what you have to say. Access to network is also very important. So sometimes for some people, if you bring someone to the conversation, someone from your network, that could add value to the conversation and could get the other person interested in engaging with you and your advocacy initiative. For other people, human emotional engagement is super relevant. So for people that tend to consider human emotional engagement important, it's very helpful if you can bring like an example of a person from the field that you met and you mention their name and you tell their story. This creates this human connection that for some people, this is really relevant and really important. It will really call the attention of the other person. And for other people, technical support may be very relevant, it may be something they are needing. And sometimes people want all of these things. And I'm not saying you should offer everything or that you're able to offer everything. So when you're studying your stakeholders, this is something important for you to ask, what is important for them? Can I offer what they need or not? And if not, do I have alternatives? So this is, some components that will form well-succeeded negotiations. So I'll pause here for a minute to check if you have questions about these negotiation tips and techniques, about this subjectivity aspect of advocacy that is related to human nature, human behavior, connections, relationships. I'll give you a minute to think if you have questions while I take some water. So I see someone said here, understanding the red line of the negotiation part is very important. I agree. This is something we should always pay attention. Having dialogues on negotiation is important. Yes. So this is what this session is about, is how to create this background, these dialogues. Sometimes when you're studying your stakeholders, you may notice that they are more interested to a certain issue. Then you can start the conversation with that issue that is important for the other person. That will create this rapport, this connection, and this positive emotion that we saw that increases the chances of success in our negotiations. So this is what we wanted to call attention on this section.
There is also a very good comment from Anawana from Zambia. who brought attention to that there is still a lot of inequality in internet access, even if it's a tool that can be used by advocates. We still need to bridge the digital divide. So it's a very good comment that internet's not available for everyone, and to something huge that people have to, a huge challenge that people have to face in some regions of the world.
Yeah, thank you for including this comment. Yeah, it can be challenging. We know this digital revolution is not equally available. Thank you so much for covering this topic. So someone else said, in climate diplomacy space, identifying the allies is also important. This is something we are going to go deeper in the next session, understanding how we can classify someone as an ally or an opponent or neutral. We'll talk a lot more about this in the next workshop. I think, can we move on, Gustavo, or do we have more questions or comments to address?
Yeah, I think so. We can move on.
Okay. So now we're starting the final part of this workshop that is about a practical guide. So we are bringing like a toolkit, a practical guide on advocacy, like to build the first steps on planning your advocacy project action. And this is what we're calling the science part of advocacy. You know, it has to do with planning, strategies. So let's start this session. So it's very important to remember that to influence a public policy, an organization must have a very well-defined strategy, because it's challenging to impact public policies. It's not a simple task. That's why we need a strong, well-planned strategy. Thus, it's important to plan in advance. So every time we have a challenge in front of us, we may need to plan in advance. This is important. And I'd like to open this with some questions. Why is it important to plan? Actually, why is it essential to make, why is it planning essential to make advocacy actions effective? And I'd like to stress and emphasize that planning in advance helps your organization to align short, mid, and long-term goals. So I think most of you have participated in strategic planning workshops, and you have observed how challenging it is to build and planning, you know, with all the organization's goals and resources and organize everything within a planning time frame. So if you include your advocacy goals on your organization's strategic planning, it will help align these short, mid, and long-term visions, both to your advocacy area, to the organization. So this is important to create this vision, this common vision, so that everyone in your organization understands where you want to go and what you want to achieve in terms of advocacy. Plan in advance also helps you to train and do onboarding with your colleagues, volunteers, and members of your coalition and alliances. And when I'm saying train, it has to do with the messaging. So in the next workshop, we're going to address the communications component of advocacy action. So when we are trying to influence people, we have to prepare messages, we have to develop, you know, key messages, a call to action. We'll go deeper on this in the next workshop. But to have time to train people, to make sure everyone is spreading the same message, we need time, you know, to have, because sometimes we have a huge coalition with a lot of members, so it's not easy to train everyone. So we need time to do this in advance. We also plan in advance to allocate existing resources. So we know that sometimes there is like a challenge in the allocation of resources within organizations and coalitions. So if you plan in advance, chances are that you may have more success in receiving resources for your advocacy activities. And of course, when you plan in advance, you identify the risks and you're able to minimize risks and maximize the opportunities. And we are going to address this next week when we talk about the mitigation plan. So every advocacy action may involve risks, you know, bigger, less or bigger risks. So preparing yourself in advance will help you minimize the risks by creating contingency plans and getting prepared to manage crises if needed. And obviously, planning in advance helps you to have time to understand how to navigate the complex dynamics of public policies. And we're going to talk about this a little bit today. So public policy arena is often complex. So planning in advance gives you time to study, to understand the landscape, to understand the stakeholders you're going to engage with. And this planning time is very important to get prepared when you meet the dynamics, the stakeholders, and when you engage on these public policies dynamics, you are more prepared. So I couldn't stress enough how I consider planning important. And I do this because in my career, you know, working with advocacy with different organizations and projects, I tend to see some organizations, they avoid doing advocacy plan, and they say it's because the political system changes a lot. And I know it changes a lot, it changes fast, but even though it changes, it's important to have at least a basic planning in place to get minimally prepared, because changing public policies, addressing these changes is not simple. So we need preparation. So in order to start getting prepared for developing your advocacy plan for COP29 and COP30, we are presenting you with a 7-step practical guide on advocacy. So this is like the basic steps to have a powerful advocacy plan in place. So today we're going to talk about the first and second steps, which are choosing priorities and setting goals and understanding decision-making. And on next Tuesday, on the next workshop, we will address the other 5 steps of this practical guide. That includes identifying stakeholders, creating a narrative, defining activities and timeline, managing risks, and monitoring and evaluating your results. Now, I'd like to start with the first step, which is choosing priorities and setting goals. And this is, for me, the first and the most important part of this guide, you know, the 7-step basic steps on creating an advocacy plan. It's when you define the problem you want to solve or you want to impact, and how your organization wants to impact this issue. So for some organizations, they have clarity, you know, the problem they want to solve is crystal clear. For other organizations, this is not so clear. So you may need to spend more time analyzing the problem and making sure you find the angle that you want to achieve, or analyzing your organization's mission and seeing which problem you want to solve. And when you do this discussion, it's very important to bear in mind that to execute an effective advocacy strategy, your organization must focus on one or very few policies or issues at the same time. And I'm saying this because we tend to think we are able to address all the challenges at the same time, and we lose strategic focus when we do this. So it's better to start with a narrow focus. And to do that, it's important to remember that we want to address change. So impacting policies is a way to address a change, and we may need to impact different policies on the way to change, to provoke the change, the lasting and positive change we want to have. So tackling policies is challenging. So you may need to break down the challenge. So let's say 2005 and 25 and 26, you want to address policy 1, and then on 2027, policy 2, and so on. So try to break down these challenges a little bit so you have more control and you can plan more effectively. And in order to prioritize, you need to do an analysis of the available resources. So it's very important that you have you and your colleagues or the members of your coalition, you do a very honest and realistic conversation about the resources you have available, both time resources, people resources, financial resources. And when you map the resources you have, you are able to prioritize and say which issues or which policies you want to tackle. And something I want to emphasize and say that it's really important is eliminating. And a lot of people have difficulties in eliminating challenges and saying no to some opportunities or some projects. They feel bad if they say no for a project or for a partnership. And I want to stress that eliminating is a very important part of your planning and choosing priorities and setting goals, part of these basic steps. Because when you're not able to eliminate, you may spread your organization's resource too thin, and then you're not able to address what you really want to impact. So don't be afraid or scared to eliminate, to say no to some projects, to some initiatives, because that will help you become more effective on the issues or the goals you identify and that you choose to tackle. So once you have selected the issue you want to tackle, you want to impact, or the policy, and you analyze the policies, the policy changes involved on this process and the resources you have available, then you're ready to identify your advocacy goals. And effective goals, they always must be measurable. So advocacy goals, they must be measurable as well. So remember, when you're writing down your advocacy goals, that they must be measurable. And if you want to build an even more effective goal, you can go through the SMART framework. This is a tool that is widely spread. A lot of people might have heard about SMART, which is making sure your goals are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And in order to do that, you make these questions, while you're writing down and elaborating your goals with your colleagues, with your coalition. In order to make sure the goal is specific, you want to ask, what do I want to accomplish? To make sure the goal is measurable, you ask, how will I know when this is accomplished? Achievable, you ask, how can the goal be accomplished? Is there, a way to achieve this? Realistic, how does this seem worthwhile? And time-bound, when can I accomplish this goal? So make these questions to make sure you have effective goals, because having effective goals is a very good way to start your advocacy plan. The second step on this guide is understanding your decision-making arena, the policy environment you are participating, where you are working at. And this is what we did in the 2 previous workshops when we studied at the UNFCCC. We were studying how the COP event works, how to navigate the COP arena. That's why this is what we did on the previous workshops. So if you didn't watch the previous workshops, spend some time watching them, because they are all about understanding decision-making and the policy arena.
I think that we lost Marina once again. Let's just wait a second. Yeah, I think that was the case. if you have any questions or comments regarding this final section, these two first steps of the practical guide that Marina is developing, please feel free to put that in the chat or raising your hand. And yes, sir, James, go ahead. This is a very good question, James. Thank you. Marina, James was talking about the structural inequalities of the UN system, specifically regarding the UNFCCC. And he was mentioning the slide that you were showing the decision-making process and all the dimensions it has. And even though we are aware of like the scenario, and we should remain positive and optimistic about change and our capacity to influence decision making in the UN system, even though these are very difficult challenges, and how we can do to overcome them.
Thanks, James, for your question. And, you know, either advocating on an international level or the national level, we always face these inequities on the access to power and decision makers. And this is clear, and it happens a lot in different regions in more or less impactful ways. So planning is a way to try to overcome these barriers, but they will always be there. I'm not saying that they don't exist or that we can overcome them completely. What I can say is that we're sharing best practices and tools that will help us overcome them as much as possible, but it's not always possible. So in the next workshop, when we deliver this template, it's like a way to minimize the impact of these inequalities. But we cannot say, unfortunately, that they will disappear. They'll still be there, the challenges, the barriers. So we are trying to provide you with the best tools we can from working on this field, from studying different best practices. So this is the best available resources we have to try to overcome these inequities. Because unfortunately, these inequities, they're huge, and they impact us advocates all the time and a lot, and they impact us differently in the regions, in the different countries regarding different issues. So when we talk about this in the next workshop, we'll go through about the mitigation plan, for example. We'll talk about a tool to try to list these challenges and how we can plan, how can we plan to manage crisis and to overcome these barriers? because they are happening all the time. We face these challenges, these barriers. So we'll talk about how to mitigate these risks and the potential crises we face on the way in our advocacy campaigns and projects. But I agree with you, it's sometimes very frustrating because there are so many barriers and they do exist. So what we're trying to do is, by advocating and being present on the debate, is that we start to at least neutralize some of these barriers and hope that in the future they impact us less. Thank you for your comment. So I'm just going to conclude this slide I was showing, and then the presentation is finished. Then we can go through other questions if you have. So I was talking about, did you follow when I talked about this slide about the understanding decision-making? Did you follow when I presented this, or?
I think it's best if you start again this slide.
Okay. Okay, so the next step on the practical advocacy 7-step guide we are presenting you is about understanding decision-making. So the public policy arena is often challenging, and that's why we need to spend some time from our planning strategy to understand this big picture. And this is what we did in the previous workshops. We had 2 workshops with Marina Esteves to understand the UNFCCC environment, the decision makers, the Paris Agreement, how to navigate the COP event. So if you haven't watched the 2 initial workshops, spend some time watching them, because they are all about understanding this decision-making dynamics on the COPs. And this is what we're talking about here, right? How to advocate effectively during COP29, COP30. But to give you some examples of what you want to look at to understand decision-making process, you want to, do an investigation or study about the arena you want to tackle by identifying the decision makers, trying to understand who the influencers of these decision makers are. And as James was saying, this is not simple, sometimes this is not clear, but try to, engage with people, make questions, read social media profiles, try to understand who these people follow on social media or who they mention when they give interviews. But I agree, it's not easy. Sometimes this is not so clear or transparent. Try to map if this decision-making process has plenary sessions, has processes, and if this process, they are formal, they are transparent, or they're more informal, and then you have to consult people, talk to people to understand how does this work. Understand if this process you want to tackle has consultation, like public consultations, if it has deadlines, stages, what are the stages, if they have public hearings or open debates, if civil society can participate on these debates or just observe. So these are things that you can map to identify potential opportunities for engagement and influence. And we have discussed this a lot in the previous 2 workshops, so I won't go deeper on this. But these are the 2 initial steps on this 101 practical guide on advocacy, on planning your advocacy activity. So before I open to questions, I'd like to say that we want to leave a homework for the next workshop, which is to prioritize and choose 1 or 2 goals for your participation at COP29 or COP30. So remember, the goals should be measurable, and I'm going to provide some examples of what a measurable goal looks like. So for example, present my organization's position paper about XYZ to at least 5 stakeholders by the end of COP29. Or identify 3 partners to fund 75% of the costs of my organization's project on XYZ by the end of COP30. So why do I ask you to choose only 1 or 2 goals? because it's important to prioritize, and because we are going to, as I said, deliver an advocacy plan template for you on the next workshop. So if you have one or two, not so many goals, it will be easier to apply them into the template. Then you can learn how to plan an advocacy agenda. And also because it's super important to prioritize, as we said before, because we cannot tackle too many policies at the same time because we have limited resources. So this is the, let's say, homework for the next workshop. Choose and bring for the next session that will happen next Tuesday, 1 or 2 goals for your participation on COP29 or COP30. And remember, they must be measurable. Now we have covered the whole content from this session, and I'd like to give some space for your comments, questions. I see Hansen has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Marina, for sharing. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay.
You are.
Yeah. I believe all of us here find it insightful of what you have shared, and yeah, personally, I found it fascinating and useful. I think continuing James' question, I think it's very interesting. I think you also answered very clear. You mentioned we're sharing the best practice, the best available resources, and I think you also from the beginning you also mentioned when you explained the intersection of advocacy with science and art and the balance between public and private sectors. I think is very interesting, and of course the practical guide, which is very useful. But my question is, I'm curious, Marina, when you about the insights that maybe you can share on the effective advocacy strategies. I mean, how do you determine the key priorities or context from stakeholders' perspective as an important things? I mean, I would like to give an example to give it a clear question. Let's say when we want to advocate some specific topics, maybe when we talk about countries between Western countries and Eastern countries, we have like different contexts, different phase, different stage, different priorities, as you mentioned also. How do you see, how do you navigate all these differences will impact the advocacy, the decision, and the priorities? Yeah, I think that's from my, thank you.
Thank you, Hansen. So is your question how understanding the priorities of the stakeholders will impact the negotiation, your advocacy negotiation? Is this question correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And but mostly more about the the different contexts and phase or stages between, let's say, countries, background, cultures, will really impact the advocacy. I just want to know what's your perspective on that.
Yeah, so first thing I'd like to mention is that we are talking here about a plan, and sometimes things don't happen the way we planned, and we need to adapt. That's why we said we have the art and the science part of advocacy. So we need a lot of adaptability and flexibility. And I wanted to talk, I spent quite some time talking about the importance of getting to know what is important for the other person, because when we are in a negotiation, in an advocacy engagement, we are expecting something from that person, right? So it could be that we expect this person to organize a public hearing, or that we want this person to address a specific issue in their speech or in the presentation they're doing. And we are competing. There are lots of priorities on the table. So there is a competition, lots of advocates presenting their agendas, their priorities. So when you understand the other person's perspectives or needs, you're able to create a connection. You start cementing a relationship with that person. You become more relevant to your stakeholder because you're addressing what is important for them. And thus you start creating a relationship, a dialogue, and then your relationship, your engagement is more effective, and the chances that this advocate will address your need is higher. So since we are competing, because at COP you won't have much time, it's a very intense event with lots of agendas going on. The more you get prepared, so if you're meeting someone at COP, I advise that you try to follow this person on social media, read what they publish, try to map who this person, in which events this person goes to. And then if they went to a certain event and you know someone who also participated in that event, you can ask, hey, have you met that person in that event you went? What that person said, so that you can form in your mind an idea of what is important for this person, what this person's agendas are. And then you can start the conversation when you engage with this person at COP or somewhere else by saying, hey, I remember you said you talk about this and that on that event. And then you quickly establish this connection. Sometimes you don't have so much time because sometimes we're meeting with an advocate and with a stakeholder and they look at their watch and they say, you have 3 minutes. And then you just have to adapt and say, your key messages, and you don't have so much time to create this connection. But when you do have this time available, it's important to create this connection because that will make your engagement activity more effective. Did I answer your question? Is it clear?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Maria. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hansen, for your comment. Do you have other questions or comments? Let me look at the chat. So someone is already thinking about the task, about how to prioritize and choose the goals. Yes, we're going to share this session. So I think this is it. I don't see other questions. Sure. No, it's a great intervention. Thanks, James. So when you get prepared, we're talking about all the levels. And next session, when we talk about mapping stakeholders. So you have to look, what are the important stakeholders for you, that for your agenda that will participate at COP. So some of them may be state representatives or senators or journalists or researchers. So when you map them, you can understand in which field they are working. So if it's a state representative, for example, you want to engage at COP, for this person, it's important to know what his electoral base thinks. So when we talk next on the next workshop about communications activities, you may want to do an engagement with, let's say, a radio station, with a TV channel to address an electoral basis of one of these senators or state representatives that will be at COP. So if you want to achieve someone at COP that comes from a certain region of your country, you can organize, in your planning activity, organize an activity to engage with this person, either engage directly with this person before COP or do a grassroots strategy where you achieve this person's electoral basis. So you don't go directly to the person, but you talk to the voters of this person. So we can think about all these levels of activities, and we are going to address this a little bit on the next workshop. I cannot promise we'll go very deep into this because we have only 2 sessions and would need a longer advocacy course to talk about this in details, but we will address this as well in the next workshop. But just to respond to your questions, we can talk about all of these levels when we are planning for this COP advocacy plan. Okay, let me check if I have other comments here. Okay, so thank you everyone. I'll hand over to Paz and Charlotte to conclude the session. Thank you so much for participating and joining.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marina. I think it's just over to us to say thank you for such a detailed and hands-on presentation with some really great tools to get us thinking and preparing for the final next session. That will be next week at the same day and time as today. You will hear from us over email with some of the recordings and materials from today. But otherwise, we hope to see you there, and please come prepared with your goals that you have thought about for COP29. I think it's going to be a very interactive session again. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much to our interpreters and to our meeting support team in the background, and to Marina and Gustavo. Thank you so much. See you next week, everybody.